There is a tree that does not need you. It does not need your soil preparation. It does not need your irrigation. It does not need your fertilizer, your pesticide, your storage facility, your cold chain, or your distribution network. It grows where most things die. It produces where most systems fail. It has been doing this, without modification, without improvement, without human correction, for approximately 5 million years. And in the last 100 years, the global food industry has done everything within its power to make you forget that. The coconut does not fit the modern agricultural model. You cannot harvest it mechanically at scale. You cannot standardize it into a uniform commodity. You cannot patent the tree. You cannot prevent a coastal farmer from planting the seeds that fall in his own yard and selling what grows there without ever purchasing anything from anyone. A resource that feeds, hydrates, shelters, and heals, and that cannot be owned, has no future inside a system built entirely on dependency. This is not a story about a fruit. This is a story about what happens to things that are too complete to be controlled. Welcome to Ancient Food Files. This channel exists in the space between what was known and what was allowed to remain known. The most resilient knowledge on Earth is rarely the most visible. It lives in the practices of farmers, in the oral traditions of island peoples, in the memory of coastlines that have been growing the same tree for 10,000 years. If preserving that record matters to you, subscribe, not for the algorithm, for the archive. Now let us go back, further than the supermarket aisle, further than the health food trend, further than the colonial port where the first European sailor held this fruit in his hands and had no word for it. We begin in the Indo-Pacific, somewhere in the broad arc of coastline stretching from the eastern shores of India through the islands of Southeast Asia and into the western Pacific. The precise origin is still debated by botanists, but the oldest genetic evidence points consistently to a region encompassing what is now Sri Lanka, southern India, and the Philippines, coastlines that have been in conversation with each other across open water for longer than most civilizations have existed. The Malay peoples called it Nair. In Sanskrit it became Narakila, a word that appears in texts over 3,000 years old. In the Pacific Island traditions it was not given a single name so much as a relationship. The people of Kiribati, the Marshall Islands, the Cook Islands, they did not describe the coconut palm as a plant they cultivated. They described it as a relative, a provider, something that had arrived before memory began and had never left. The Malay oral tradition holds that the first coconut grew from the burial place of a great sea creature, that the tree is the ocean made terrestrial, still carrying salt in its memory. This is not metaphor dressed as religion. This is ecological observation given the dignity of story. The physical tree is extraordinary in ways that become more remarkable the longer you look. Cocos nucifera grows to 30 meters. It lives for 100 years. It begins producing fruit within 6 to 10 years of planting and then does not stop, bearing between 50 and 200 coconuts annually for the remainder of its life without replanting, without intervention, without rest. A mature grove of coconut palms, left to itself, continues feeding the families living beneath it across multiple generations. The fruit itself is sealed architecture. The outer husk, the exocarp and mesocarp, is fibrous and buoyant and resistant to saltwater, designed by evolution specifically for ocean dispersal. The inner shell, the endocarp, is one of the hardest naturally occurring seed casings on Earth, capable of surviving months of immersion in seawater without any damage to the germinating embryo inside. The white flesh stores both nutrition and fat. The liquid inside provides electrolytes in ratios that, in emergencies, have been used in place of intravenous saline. The shell burns as fuel, the fiber becomes rope, matting, brushes, the leaves thatch roofs, the trunk builds walls and bridges. Every part of this tree is useful, none of it requires processing before use. In 1521, Ferdinand Magellan's expedition arrived in the Pacific Islands already weakened by scurvy, dysentery, and starvation. What kept a significant number of those men alive through the crossing was documented in the journals of Antonio Pigafetta: coconut water drunk directly from the fruit, coconut flesh consumed raw when no fire was possible. Pigafetta wrote that in the islands they encountered, the coconut palm was treated as a treasury, not metaphorically, practically. During the Bengal famine of 1943, in which an estimated 2 to 3 million people died of starvation under wartime policies that diverted food resources, the communities along the coastal strips of what is now Bangladesh and West Bengal, where coconut palms grew in density, recorded significantly lower mortality rates than interior populations, not because anyone designed it that way, because the tree was already there. In the Second World War, Medical records from Pacific Theater Field hospitals document the use of young coconut water as an emergency plasma substitute in transfusions when conventional supplies were unavailable. It was not an experiment. It was knowledge that Pacific Islanders had carried without documentation for centuries, finally noticed by necessity. The Japanese military, occupying Pacific Islands during the same war, made specific tactical decisions around coconut groves, protecting them, harvesting them, understanding immediately what the colonizing powers had spent centuries dismissing. An army that controls the coconut palms controls the food supply of an island. The grove was infrastructure. It always had been. The 20th century did not destroy the coconut palm. It did something quieter and more lasting. It discredited the fat. In the 1950s and 1960s, as the American processed food industry built itself around partially hydrogenated vegetable oils, cheap, shelf-stable, mechanically produced, coconut oil emerged as an obstacle. It was already used across South and Southeast Asia, the Pacific, and coastal Africa in ways that predated any food science, and it was saturated. The research connecting saturated fat to cardiovascular disease, research that was later shown to be significantly influenced by the sugar industry's funding and framing, arrived at a moment when coconut oil represented competition. The American Heart Association issued guidelines in the 1960s recommending against saturated fats. Coconut oil, lumped into the same category as animal lard, disappeared from Western kitchens within a generation. The fact that the populations consuming the most coconut oil on Earth, coastal Kerala, the Philippines, the Pacific Islands, showed none of the cardiovascular disease rates predicted by the model was not investigated. It was inconvenient. The regional varieties of coconut that had been selected over thousands of years for specific climates, specific soils, specific uses, the tall varieties of Kerala, the dwarf varieties of Southeast Asia, the wild-type palms of the Maldives, began their quiet disappearance as commercial monoculture standardized around the highest-yield hybrids. Genetic diversity, the actual insurance policy of a species against climate and disease, was quietly exchanged for uniformity. What cannot be standardized is unmanageable. What cannot be patented is unownable. What cannot be concentrated into supply chains is, in the language of modern agriculture, inefficient. The science that dismissed coconut fat has been, in the last 2 decades, substantially revised. Research published in the European Journal of Clinical Nutrition and the Journal of Nutritional Biochemistry has examined medium-chain triglycerides, the specific saturated fats dominant in coconut oil, and found that they are metabolized differently from long-chain saturated fats. They are processed directly by the liver rather than stored in adipose tissue. They generate ketone bodies. They show antimicrobial properties in laboratory settings, specifically against Staphylococcus aureus and Candida albicans. The lauric acid in coconut oil, comprising approximately 47% of its fat content, has been studied for its role in immune function, specifically in viral envelope disruption. Studies of traditional Pacific and South Asian populations consuming coconut as a dietary staple, populations that have consumed it for millennia, not as a supplement but as a primary caloric source, show consistently low rates of the cardiovascular conditions that mid-century science predicted their diets would cause. The ancient knowledge was not wrong. It was inconvenient and then discredited and then, very quietly, confirmed. In the Philippines, there is a generation that grew up watching their grandparents cook exclusively in coconut oil, langising naig, and then spent their middle years avoiding it entirely on medical advice, substituting refined vegetable oils imported at cost. Their children are now returning to the old practice, not because of a trend, but because the evidence has circled back. But the knowledge was interrupted. The unbroken transmission from grandmother to grandchild, the understanding of which variety to use for which dish, which part of the fruit to cook with and which to preserve, how to read the color of the oil for quality, that knowledge has gaps in it now, gaps that a decade of scientific papers cannot fully fill. The forgetting was not accidental. It was manufactured, slowly and at significant profit, by systems that required dependency where the coconut had always offered independence. The coastlines of the world are changing. Rising sea levels are already pushing salt into freshwater tables across Bangladesh, Vietnam, the Pacific atolls, and the Florida Peninsula. Conventional crops, rice, wheat, maize, fail immediately under saline intrusion. The coconut palm tolerates it. Its roots evolved for saltwater edges. It grows in the precise geography that is becoming the crisis zone of the 21st century. Soil degradation from synthetic input agriculture is advancing at rates that suggest the productive capacity of large portions of the world's current farmland will collapse within decades. The coconut palm does not require fertile soil. It has been documented growing in pure sand. The global food system is concentrated into a small number of crops, a small number of companies, and a small number of supply chains, any one of which can be severed by drought, conflict, or logistics failure. The coconut grove, by contrast, is already distributed, already producing, already outside the supply chain entirely. The tree does not need the crisis to arrive before it begins preparing. It has been preparing for 5 million years. There is a practice among the Malay fishing communities of coastal Kelantan. Before a long voyage, the fisherman places a young coconut at the prow of the boat, not as decoration, as acknowledgement, as a reminder that the tree came before the sailor, crossed oceans before the ship was built, and will be growing on whatever shore the sailor reaches long after the voyage is forgotten. The knowledge was never lost. It was growing on every tropical coastline on Earth while the systems that dismissed it rose and fell. The coconut does not require vindication. It does not require a trend. It requires only a coastline, a warm season, and the absence of anyone deciding it is unworthy of attention. Nature does not wait for permission to persist. It waits for the forgetting to end. If this archive matters to you, if the knowledge that survives without systems deserves to be preserved, subscribe to Ancient Food Files. The next record is already waiting.